Welcome back to Adventures of a Black Belt Sommelier, sponsored by Four Paws Restaurant, the iconic fine dining restaurant in St. Paul, Minnesota, with wonderful food, attentive professional service, and ever evolving, improving, I hope, wonderful wine list. I think I'm pretty proud of it. I've said quite a few times on this podcast that sometimes it's really good to be the sommelier. Last Wednesday, it was really, really good to be the sommelier at Four Paws Restaurant. The guest who comes in about every 6 weeks and always brings something special to have with dinner. He always orders at least one bottle from the wine list, in addition to have the wine that he brings with him. But he always brings something really special. Last Wednesday night, he walked in the door, and I saw him. I went over to say hello, and he handed me this bottle of wine with the kind of casual uh, body language, as if it had been a loaf of bread. And I looked down, and it was a bottle of 1982 Chateau Petrus. I don't get shook up about wine very often in my life because, I've been lucky. You name the legendary wine. I've either opened it, served it, drunk it, tasted it, maybe many times, multiple times. You name the legendary winery. I've conducted tastings of 50 vintages, 75 vintages, 100 vintages of some wines. I've I was the sommelier at a tasting of 50 vintages of Chateau Petrus once. So I've tasted at least 50 vintages of Chateau Petrus. It's more than that because I've tasted other vintages that weren't included in that tasting. But so it's a wine that's kind of embedded in my brain. Obviously, it's one of the legendary wines of the world, one of the most iconic wines of the world. And of course, 1982 is one of the greatest vintages ever in Bordeaux. 43 years old for this wine is, you would expect it to be absolutely magnificent from this vintage if stored well. So anyway, I opened it and I asked the guest if he'd like it decanted. He said, let me taste it first. And he did. He said, yes, go on and decant it. So I did. And then, about, I don't know, 45 minutes later, when it was time for the 82 Petrus to be served, I went to pour him and his guests their glasses. And he said, wait a minute, go get a glass. I want you to have some of this. So I went and got a glass, came back, handed him the decanter because I always let the guests decide how much wine I'm going to get. And he just poured and poured and poured. There was like maybe 5 ounces of this incredible wine in the glass when I said, stop, please stop. That's too much. You can't keep pouring. This wine's for you, not for me. So he did stop pouring and I poured everybody their glasses. And ended up, there were four of them. So it ended up, we all each had about 5 ounces of 82 Petrus. It was kind of my last party of the night that I needed to take care of. And so I was sitting at the bar waiting for my dinner to take home and tasting this magnificent wine. I mean, it was magnificent. It was like some kind of amalgam of cashmere and velvet and silk in your mouth. It was so smooth and rich and textured and soft and round. Well, it couldn't have been anything other than Petrus. Uh, I mean, there are other great Merlots in the world like Redigaffi and Massetto and Eddie Sellers and, Duckhorn Three Palms, and of course, other Pomerol estates like Le Pen and Trotanoy and L'Evangile. But there's nothing like Petrus. And there certainly is nothing like 1982 Petrus that has been stored well, which this bottle, well, that's the point of the story. So I'm drinking the magnificent glass of wine. Um, I've tasted a lot of great wine. I've drunk a lot of great wine in my life, but it really is impossible for a wine to be more extraordinary than this bottle of wine was. It's impossible to not be influenced by the label, which is why it's important to taste wine blind. But so when it's 82 Petrus, there's a certain expectation. Um, but this wine was certainly meeting the expectations. However, it didn't taste 43 years old. It tasted, to me, it tasted 25 years old or 20 years old. But it also tasted like Petrus from a really great vintage. And those are basically 2009 and 1982, really, really great vintage. There's 1990, 95, uh, there's other good vintages, 2000, but the 2000 would not be this developed. The 90 would be more developed. I mean, it just really could only have been the 82, but it didn't taste 43 years old. So I went back to the table and I said, I asked you a question. He said, of course. I said, how cold is your wine cellar? Because this wine it tastes like it's 25 years old, not 43 years old. And he said, well, my cellar's 55 degrees, but there's more to the story. He said, I can't wait to hear what your explanation of why this wine tastes, looks, smells, and tastes the way it does. He said, well, I was an investor in a wine hedge fund in Luxembourg. And I read in the Financial Times that this hedge fund was in trouble. So I contacted them and said I wanted to cash out my holdings. And if they would give me a 10% premium, I would take it in wine rather than cash. And they agreed to that. So my wife and I flew to Luxembourg and we went in this warehouse where it was temperature and humidity controlled warehouse where there were just cases and cases and cases of the greatest wines in the world, including a lot of original wooden cases unopened of Petrus, various vintages. So my wife said, why don't we just load up on Petrus and go home? So we did. We cashed out in Petrus. Original wooden cases unopened of Petrus. If you know much about rare and collectible wine, you know that wine in an original wooden case is worth substantially more than if the case has been opened because it's more likely to have been stored well and it's less likely to be counterfeit. Um, so he said, this wine turns out that the Petrus that I took as my cash out in this hedge fund was from a collector in Puerto Rico who, when he died, his children they didn't know what to do with the wine, so they stored it in a refrigerated container at 43 degrees and left it there for 20 years. So at 43 degrees, wine doesn't really change. It stays the same. That's so this wine, that explains why it tasted like it was 20 or 25 years old, because it didn't age for 20 years. 43 minus 20 is 23. So this bottle of wine was like a time machine. It was like going back to 2005 and tasting 82 Petrus. Only it was 43 years old, not 20 years old, 23 years old. But it tasted like it was 23 years old. It tasted like it had been stored perfectly with a very good cork for 23 years at 55 degrees, because it was stored at 55 degrees for 23 years. It was just stored at 43 degrees for 20 years. And as I said, at 43 degrees, the wine doesn't change. So I would say this is one of my better blind tasting performances because I kind of sleuthed out what the very unusual provenance of this wine was. I mean, I couldn't have possibly have guessed that it was stored at 43 degrees for 20 years, but I did know there was something unusual about the way it was stored because of how young it appeared to be, but how great it appeared to be. So it could only be a great vintage like 82, but it wasn't 43 years old. Maybe I've learned something all these years. I hope if some of my mentors like Evan Goldstein and Fred Dame and Larry Stone watching this, they'll be proud of me for actually learning all the things they try to beat into this thick, hard skull of mine, or some of them anyway. Madeline Trepon would be another one of those. Thanks for tuning in to Adventures of a Black Belt Sommelier. We appreciate it every time you do. And I hope you are having a wonderful, wonderful week, day, and hour, and month, and year today.